elections updates. This is something that I'm not following at all because I don't know where to start. There's too much for me to even try to. So fill in the crowd. Last week we were talking about the extensions to count ballots post-election. We were waiting for a Supreme Court decision last week, which did not come down.
Exactly, like we talked about in the show. It was clear that Barrett apologists were already putting out an advance warning, basically encouraging her. And for folks that don't know this, a lot of these intellectual types and political types are really communicating to judges when they're writing their little op-eds or opinion pieces. Often their audience is not you or me. Their audience is, say, a Judge Sullivan. And notice how well it worked in that case. So he wasn't writing an editorial to the world. It had one audience, but it would be at least inappropriate to communicate ex parte with them. So you just write an editorial in the Washington Post, he reads. So Shipwrecked Crew, who was one of these people who had been attacking me personally for disagreeing about Barrett. And I found that weird. And I was like, okay, this guy must be a Barrett apologist to be part of the establishment. He also was predicting Durham was going to bring indictments and all this other stuff. Never happened. Almost as if it was deliberate misinformation by people like him. Keep people on the hook. Hey, everybody, don't worry. Keep Trump at bay. The indictments are right around the corner. It's always been my problem with Q, is that it tends to disincentivize people's independent investigative work and activism because they think everything's under control when it's not. So he put out, and that was part of it. I referenced it last Sunday. I said, watch. All of these people, I can guarantee you, Trump was specifically promised that Barrett would be a yes vote for him on elections as the deal that sealed the deal for her to be nominated over other people. She gets nominated. Then right after her confirmation vote, the news story, all of a sudden these little opinion pieces started coming out, which I think were written to her, not written for us, which were, probably should recuse yourself from these cases. It might look bad if you jump in right now. And that's what I talked about last Sunday. I'd seen some of these pieces because I tracked these people. And I was like, I bet that despite what Trump had been promised, she's going to find an excuse not to rule on the election cases. And that's exactly what happened. So all those people that said, oh, she's the greatest justice and I hope she ends up being a great justice, of course. But there were a lot of warning signs like this. I mean, the one person who put her there is President Trump. And it's the first person she betrays when she gets on the bench. What does that tell you about her character, folks? Anybody banking on her is banking on, might as well, double down on Justice Roberts. So
I was going to be more inclined to forgive. Now, from what I understood, the argument was that she could not be debriefed fast enough to issue an opinion.
That makes no sense because this was an emergency injunctive release that they refiled solely because they knew she was now back on there was no reason to refile it. It had already been turned down 4-4. So there's no reason to refile unless you're doing it for her. So they refile, and it's just an emergency injunctive motion. So all you do is read the emergency injunction motion. And by the way, that excuse was the very excuse her apologists were using 2 days before she got on the bench. They were saying, here's what it was only being leaked, put in certain circles and then spread a little bit wider. But they were saying, probably it's too late for you to really get involved in this. So it's mighty interesting that she mimicked the language they were giving her to use. But it makes no sense. This was just an emergency injunctive relief. They only refiled it because she was on the bench. So they clearly thought she was going to rule on it. In terms of what she had to do, like somebody were saying, it's a whole, this was not a petition for cert. This wasn't a situation where she didn't participate in the initial vote on the petition for cert. And in that context, you're usually not supposed to be involved in deciding an issue because it's respecting the initial vote process is what's happening there. This was just an emergency injunctive relief that they simply refiled after she was appointed solely for the purpose for her to vote on it.
So explain to the layperson then what happens. She says, I can't be debriefed. I'm not going to issue a judgment. What happens to the original judgment, and what is the original judgment, or what is the standing judgment now?
It then basically goes back to the original 4-4 split. So without her changing the vote, being the tipping factor, the prior vote became binding effectively. I mean, it's not like binding. It just means no reason to keep filing your emergency injunctive relief. If it was really the case she wanted more briefing, she could have asked for more briefing. The folks, all this was reading about 100 pages. That's all that it required. She wanted it to be done proper and correct. man, you got sucker tattooed on your forehead if you believe that. So again, they didn't refile it because they thought she would recuse herself. They would, and if she wanted a couple of extra days, she could have done that. She said she basically, whatever message she sent to the other justices, their conclusion was not, hey, let's postpone it a couple of days, let's have additional briefing. It was, nothing's going to happen now between now and election day, because since then they decided to stay out of it altogether. And instead, the problem with people are saying, oh, it's better if she waits until after the election to get involved. That's much worse and much less likely the courts are going to get involved. It's one thing to try to stop something from happening before it happens. It's another thing to try to actually throw out ballots. The Democrats are going to go insane if they try to throw out ballots. There was major problems after Bush v. Gore, and it will be tenfold intense if that happens again. So could she still possibly rule in a way that helps, that saves the election from Trump? Yes, but it's much less likely to occur. She allowed Pennsylvania to keep doing what they're doing, allowed North Carolina to keep doing.
Refresh my memory and refresh everybody's memory who's watching. Pennsylvania now can count. What is it? Can they count ballots up until a week after the election?
In Pennsylvania, it's 3 days. So 3 things can happen. One, if any ballot comes in within 3 days by the end of next week, then it has to be presumed to have been sent correctly, unless there's a postmark that clearly, irrefutably shows it wasn't sent timely, and it has to count. Now, the Pennsylvania Attorney General made a smart move of saying he'll segregate those ballots from the other ballots, so if the issue comes back up, they'll know which ones are which. But what he knows is his argument's 100 times stronger when he's got 100,000 ballots there. Because what Democrats are saying, oh my goodness, Trump's trying to steal it. He wants to throw out 100,000 ballots, like is what's happening right now in a Texas case. And
I saw Pete Buttigieg tweet that. I wasn't exactly familiar with what the accusation was. What is the nature of that accusation?
Yeah. So, all right. So for just to wrap up Pennsylvania, the other thing is, they cannot even check the signature. So right now, unsigned ballots can show up, or signatures that clearly don't even get close to matching the original signature. So they can be it's the only check on fraud. So hundreds of thousands, millions of ballots can show up after Election Day without a postmark showing it was sent before Election Day, as long as there's nothing saying otherwise, without it being properly signed, and they will be counted as of now in the Pennsylvania presidential election because of Barrett's refusal to act. Now, in Houston, in Harris County, Texas, they put certain places to gather ballots that Republicans claim they didn't have legal authority to do. There's some other claims that are part of that case. And about 120,000 ballots are subject to dispute about whether they were properly placed in the place that they should have been in for the purposes of being counted. And so they have on Monday an emergency hearing on what's going to happen. And what's happening in some of these test cases, here's my view. I'll give Republican perspective. The Republican perspective is Democrats are seeing what they can get away with. And so in some cities and some counties, they've pushed the envelope. Pennsylvania, they pushed the envelope through the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. In Harris County, they pushed the envelope about how they could gather ballots in the first place. And it's because of an underlying problem. African-American urban turnout is much less than what they thought it would be. Despite vote by mail was supposed to substitute for the lack of enthusiasm in the African-American and Hispanic communities. It didn't work. And so there's a belief on the Republican side that Democrats are now just trying to stuff ballots. Because here's the problem. If you have a place where ballots were placed, the concern is ballot harvesting taking place. And this goes to Project Veritas. It was in Texas that they found people saying undercover. So they found people in Minnesota paying people to register, paying people to do ballots, who appeared to have been engaged in ballot harvesting more than what was legal in Minnesota. Then in Houston, there's the lawsuit. And in other part of Texas, Project Veritas found somebody undercover going around effectively harvesting ballots when they weren't supposed to be doing that. And for people who don't know what ballot harvesting is, it's someone acting as an intermediary between the voter and the election board. They're picking up the ballot.
The argument for ballot harvesting, from what I understand, is that people are doing it for the elderly who can't displace themselves to deliver their ballots. So they go harvest the ballots and then, I guess, plant them at the electoral office or whatever. But It's always cloaked in good intentions, and I'm not suggesting that there are nefarious intentions all the time, because undoubtedly there are good intentions. So that's it. It's picking up for people who can't deliver them for whatever the reason.
Exactly. And the Democratic perspective is that the more people that voting should be as easy as possible, because the more people that vote, now they'll admit this, politically it benefits them. But even if it didn't, they think that's a more honest expression of democracy. So like I got into a debate on Twitter with a journalist out of Florida who was enraged about not being able to have ballots come in after Election Day. And this was not Florida, but it happened in Minnesota. So it happened in Minnesota. In Michigan, the court shut down. Any ballots have to come in by Election Day. Wisconsin, same deal. Seventh Circuit stepped in, said no, it has to come in by Election Day. And the Eighth Circuit did the same thing to Minnesota this week. They said all ballots have to come in by Election Day. Now, what they said is if any ballot does not come in by Election Day, it should be segregated, not destroyed, just segregated.
Just in case there's an adjudication that says we know which ones came in late, we know which ones came in before definitively, so we'll debate over the lesser amount. In theory, we might even know if the numbers are going to be so insignificant that they're not going to alter anything, and in which case it becomes academic to some extent.
Exactly, correct. And so the concern in Texas, and so all the concerns on the Republican side is that this facilitates fraud because there's no gatekeeper. And by the way, it was actually a Republican person who got caught doing this in North Carolina, not in a Republican Democrat race, but within a Republican primary, was doing illicit ballot harvesting. And there's the question is, how do we know a vote came from that person? And then how do we know that vote was their honest expression of conscience, not the product of bribery, not the product of coercion? Well, the main way that's where we have the witness signature requirement, somebody to witness the person filling out the ballot. The signature requirement, I have to sign it and it has to match my signature on my voter registration file. And I have to request it and I have to deliver it. The more you reduce those safeguards, the more fraud is easier to occur. From the Democratic perspective, they're just making it easier for people to vote. And that all these hindrances just make it harder for people to vote, and particularly poor and lower income communities. From the Republican perspective, these measurements are necessary to substitute for it. And generally, I lean on Republican on a lot, even though I've done a lot of the Democratic arguments in some of these contexts. I do think we need another method other than signatures because there's a problem with people not remembering their signatures. As people's signatures change over time. So that really is a problem. And I'm sympathetic to the Democratic perspective on that. But that's what my view is. Go in and vote. We've been doing this for 200 plus years in America, thousands of years around the world. You walk in, you go physically and vote. And if you're disabled, they have to make mechanisms available to you to make sure you can vote. The idea that people can't, that somehow COVID magically prevents people from voting is something I just have never accepted.
There's a number of things I've never understood. From what I understand, everybody outside of America, voter ID here, I've mentioned it multiple times, voter ID, proof of residence, nobody complains. And there's no arguments of systemic racism resulting from that. The idea that, there are exceptions, but that you bring in the ballot box to individual residences versus having the residents come to the ballot box obviously has problems, and exceptions aside, a system should be in place. But no, look, we know the arguments. It's the traditional arguments. Everything is always cloaked in good intentions. And even if the intentions are true good intentions, the road to hell is paved in good intentions, because there's always negative players out there who are going to take advantage of the path of least resistance for their nefarious deeds, and softening up the rules to make it easy for everyone to vote makes it easy for people to manipulate the vote. We don't really have that problem. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and the fraudulently vote. Like I mentioned last week, Bill Clinton thought it happened all the time. So why does he think that if vote fraud never occurs? Like the myth that the left repeats is they'll say vote fraud never occurs. The myth that the right repeats is that vote suppression never occurs. Both occur because both sides are trying to get an edge. And historically, that's always been the case. So we want the most fair, free, transparent elections possible, for which the best method we've ever known, the Australian secret ballot, works the best. People come in person, get to vote in secret. In Nevada, I loved it. I walked in and they print out. Actually, they didn't let me keep the receipt. Maybe they never did. Maybe I always thought that was the case. But what is they print it out so that after you do your ballot, you get to cross-check and make sure it's correct. And you can correct it if the computer got something wrong, anything else going wrong. But it's showing you what's going into the computer system. Now, that doesn't necessarily prevent some other kind of hacking from occurring, but it's at least the most. I was like, this is the way it should work. This is transparent. This is totally safe and protected. This is secret. This is confidential. This is anonymous. Coercion can't happen. Fraud can't happen. Now, they don't require my ID. They require like date of birth and some other stuff. But my view is they should require ID. Now, my sister witnessed an incident where someone had a passport. The passport had expired. Person didn't let them vote. They do what's called a supplemental ballot, or the language may vary in certain places. A provisional ballot is what it's called most places. And what is, you're allowed to vote. It's put in a different place. If you come in later and prove your ID, then they have your ballot count. But she witnessed a situation where someone was probably overly restrictive with ID. And given that the people involved were African American, was concerned that racial prejudice may have played a role. So there's no question voter suppression has historically occurred. It still occurs. There's also no question that voter fraud occurs, and historically has occurred.
Someone actually just posted, like, voter fraud doesn't have to be widespread to be a problem. It, in fact, has to be very minimally spread. But what do you think? 1%? 0.5%?
Yeah. Well, my view is to succeed, to get away with it. I think Roy Moore's election had a lot of voter fraud involved, but everybody hated Roy Moore in Alabama in the judiciary, so nobody was going to do anything about it. Here's the hard part for people out there. So on election, how would you be able to tell whether voter fraud took place? The thing is, we have jurisdictions in America that have like groups vote alike in America. So say urban, lower income African-American voters, so Mexican-American voters, they can vary depending on location, but not a whole lot. But let's certain white voter groups, other places. But if you're measuring, the biggest fear about voter suppression is lower income African-American voters. And the biggest fear of voter fraud is padding the ballots and claiming that lower income African-American voters voted. So that's where it's on both sides. And if you go back through American history, like the way a lot of this originated was when the slaves were freed in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. This is actually kind of portrayed in Free State of Jones, where they tried to vote and they suppressed the vote. The flip side also happened. There were a lot of, purportedly in parts of Alabama, a bunch of ex-slaves voted to disenfranchise themselves in the future. Chances are that was not an accurate count of the ballot. Now, you did have literacy issues, so maybe they were misled, but something happened that wasn't accurate. But that's where a lot of these concerns originated and arose. The focus in some places is Mexican American. West Texas has been a history of a source of allegations of both voter suppression and voter fraud. But the thing is, because those like groups are around the country, if you have very low turnout amongst African American voters in Miami and Jacksonville and in Columbia, South Carolina, in parts of the Tar Heel country part of North Carolina, or in sort of rural southern areas, or in urban areas like, say, Cleveland in Ohio, or Indianapolis in Indiana. If Philadelphia has the highest African-American urban turnout in the entire country by a large margin, all Democrats know there's going to be a suspicion of voter fraud. If on the flip side, if they have unusually low turnout, then there's going to be legitimate concerns about voter suppression. So basically they tend to vote very similar. So like the way in Roy Moore's case, the way I knew that I actually set out to prove that voter fraud did not occur. And I for people who don't know, I used to do political campaigns when I was a kid. So I've been doing that for about 30 years. I ran a mayoral campaign of an African American candidate in my hometown, Chattanooga. We almost won. And I suspected that the voter fraud was the difference between a runoff and not having a runoff, because we missed it by 3 points. And on election night, it was just half a point, 1 point to get a runoff. And the difference was the early voting. And the early voting was a lot of African-American voters who didn't vote for the African-American candidate for mayor, which did not make sense. And they were part of a political machine who were being bussed to the polls by the Democratic political machine that I was up against. And 2 years later, the people that were involved in that voter organization effort ended up in prison on a different fraud scheme. So I've witnessed voter fraud. I have zero doubts about it occurring. But you can measure it and check it by looking at like precincts. When I went to prove Roy Moore voter fraud did not occur, I just compared like precincts. So heavily Democratic urban African-American precincts in Birmingham, because the way voter fraud happens on that scale is it tends to be really just whoever runs the precinct sticks in a bunch of extra votes. And if they're smart and they're not lazy like the ones in Detroit were in 2016, they make sure to check off the signatures of just a bunch of people that didn't actually vote. but they know no one's who's going to cross-check whether they actually voted that day. How do you prove they didn't vote that day? And it's an overwhelmingly Democratic vote group, so it's not like they're going to be mad that someone claimed they voted when they didn't. So but what happens is, because it tends to be precinct driven, one precinct will show unusual turnout, and a precinct right down the street will not show that unusual turnout. That's what happened in Roy Moore's case. So you had precincts that voted at almost 95% of the presidential level. Down the street, one that voted at about 60, which was the norm, 60 to 65% of the presidential vote. And that happened all across Birmingham and all over Alabama. Now, this one will be a little different because the ballot stuffing could happen at the post office by a postal employee, by someone that delivers it to the post office in such a way that it's not distinct to any particular precinct. But you'll still be able to compare if Pittsburgh African-American urban vote is, say, down 10% relative to 2016, and North Philadelphia is up 40%, you're going to know there was probably an issue. So that's why I say voter fraud, to be effective and not get caught, needs to be less than a point.
Yeah, but I mean, first of all, how do you go back and prove that after the fact, just because of discrepancies among districts? You'd go cross-check the ballots with the signatures, and
you have to really try to investigate. You have to find out who did it. So the data tells you that it likely occurred. Then you have to, the hard part of having to prove it is you've got to go cross-check and find people. If they screw up, they voted for someone who died. That would be the evident one, right? So some dead people vote. And sometimes they do that. As I say, it depends on the correct, like here, to give you how bad it was in Detroit, when they were doing the recount vote, because Democrats had funded Jill Stein, paid off her debt in order to get her to do recounts. The reason why they suddenly stopped everybody and everything, all of a sudden that whole story disappeared overnight, is because in Detroit, they were finding precincts with more votes than voters. Someone had been too lazy to check off the list. Now, that's another way you can prove voter fraud. If there's more votes than voters, then you got pretty good evidence.
Yeah, that's actually, I'm trying to pull up the comment where a few people were saying you get more than 100% turnout in certain districts, but I can't pull up anyone. I can't find those comments now. And let me just get rid of this one. Okay, so the bottom line now, the Pennsylvania, Texas, the issues are going to be whether or not they're going to be counting ballots that come in after the election, and whether or not they're going to be counting ballots that do not have a definitive pre-election postmark on them. And that's going to be the same question in Texas as well?
Yes. Well, no, in Texas, a little bit different. Texas is about how the vote went from the person who voted to the election commission. It's about a drop box. I don't know all the details about it, but they're going to have a hearing on it Monday. And what's interesting is all the liberals who tell me that judges don't make rulings based on politics are all enraged because the judge that got assigned the case is a conservative Republican in the county. So
it is amazing. It's amazing. Well, it's just back to projection again. It's a pathological thing. Okay, now I think it's a good segue into Project Veritas.